Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special virtual event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rachel Person. I'm the event manager of Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York. I'm here, as I so often am these days, with my good friend and colleague, Davith Wood, event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Manchester Center, Vermont. A couple of quick notes before we get started. First of all, thank you everyone who's here tonight for your incredible support of independent bookstores and independent bookselling. It means the world to us and to our fellow indies. A logistical note, please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you have tonight. We will have time for some audience questions at the end of the evening. You can pop questions into that Q&A box at any point throughout the event. We will save them up and ask them for you a little bit later on. And then thank you so much to our incredible event partners this evening. We are proud to continue Northshire's longstanding collaboration with our friends at Yaddo, the nationally respected, even internationally respected artist retreat located here in Saratoga Springs, New York. It's a great joy to work with them to present events highlighting the work of Yaddo's incredible roster of author alumni. In addition, tonight's event has been presented in partnership with some of our favorite fellow independent bookstores: Anderson's Bookshop, Bookhampton, Book Passage, Changing Hands Bookstore, Gibson's Bookstore, the King's English Bookshop, Pegasus Books, R.J. Julia Booksellers, and R.J. Julia Wesleyan, and the Tattered Cover. Thank you, indies, and thank you to our friends who support those indies, as well as all of our great Northshire customers. Now, Davith is going to introduce our author. Thank you so much, Davith.
Thanks, Rachel. I am so pleased to introduce Colm Tóibín this evening, here to celebrate the paperback release of his novel, The Magician, winner of the Rathbones Folio Prize. He's the author of 10 novels, including The Master, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, Brooklyn, winner of the Costa Book Award, The Testament of Mary, and Nora Webster, as well as 2 story collections and several books of criticism. He's been named as the laureate for Irish fiction for 2022 to 2024 by the Arts Council of Ireland and shortlisted 3 times for the Booker Prize. Please join me in welcoming Colm Tóibín.
Thank you very
much.
So much. You'll have to forgive the sunlight here. I'm actually in Los Angeles, so it's a bit brighter here than it may be on the East Coast. Some years ago, when I was working on this novel, The Magician, I went to Brazil. I was in Brazil, and I went to the house where Thomas Mann's mother was born. This is on an inlet in a place called Paraty. Inlet meaning the water is very calm, and the house is right on the edge of the water. It's a 2-story house. And of course, I realized that with the sky being clear most of the time, that the starlight at night would have really been something and would have come and reflected into the water, and you could have even be able to read by that sort of starlight in the southern hemisphere at night. I thought what it would be like. Thomas Mann's mother, as a young girl, was moved from here to Lübeck in the north of Germany. In other words, she came from this very bright place to this overcast northern place. And whereas Thomas Mann's mother, her father was German, he was a German trader. Her mother was Brazilian, meaning she was of mixed race, meaning that this young girl in Lübeck, which is really, you know, it would have been a very unusual thing for such a girl to be in such a city. What was an exotic presence? And Thomas Mann's father, the senator, coming from a long line of traders and merchants in Lübeck, all in a way very conservative and rigid and Protestant and serious, that his marriage to her, to Julia, would have made all the difference, especially to the children they had. In other words, while all the other traders in Lübeck were marrying people, families of other traders, this, the father of Thomas Mann, married outside this world into someone Thomas Mann always believes who brought the southern hemisphere into the north. He felt it was in his own eyes, in his skin. He felt it was also in the sort of mixtures with him and with his brother Heinrich, who was also a novelist. Thomas Mann was born in Lübeck in 1875. This is a small bit from the opening towards the opening of the book. In the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, or what they were like, or what language they spoke. A country many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, is more than 10 times longer than the Rhine and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reach back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did. They could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty was on the water, his mother would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible like the sun during the day. They're small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said you could sometimes read a book in the upstairs rooms at night, because the light from the stars against the water was so clear, and you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about the ship, Thomas said. You must go to sleep. Tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar, but just a small part again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they're eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? You must ask your father that. Thomas Mann was brought up as a little prince. He was the second son in a family of 5. They were famous merchants and traders in Lübeck. His father's a senator. And so this was a completely stable world where the business was handed on from father to son over many generations, where the furniture they owned, the different houses they had, all had belonged to earlier generations. Thomas Mann's father died when he was in his early teens, and that ended that world that was so stable and so richly present in there. That childhood came to an abrupt end. His father ordered that the business be wound up. So the name suddenly, Mann, that was written on so many things, warehouses, ships, offices, that ended its time as a thing of importance in Lübeck. And the will his father made was a sort of punitive will. It didn't just order the business to be wound up. It had guardians and protectors and various people, so that his wife, his widow now, Julia, with 5 children, had really no autonomy. And she felt that she'd been humiliated by the will. And she decided to move to Munich, which was a very big move in the Germany of the 1880s into the 1890s. In other words, it was a much more cosmopolitan city. It was the capital of Bavaria, and thus it was a sort of Catholic city. But more than that, it had a large Jewish population and also a large Bohemian population. So Thomas Mann stayed behind in Lübeck for a year, but then he finally arrived in Munich. And of course, for him, he knew no one there. He moved from being fully visible, fully known, to being nobody, to being like a ghost in the streets of this new city. So when as a young man who was interested in writing and interested in art, when he went into the cafes or when he saw art students on the streets, there were people he didn't know and who didn't know him. And so that he was an outsider there. What he had in a way with him, besides some literary talent, was the great gift that he had lost the place that had mattered most to him. That as he went into his 20s, and with his brother Heinrich, their mother paying for this, both of them went to Italy, where they could both try and become writers. Heinrich, older than Thomas, had already published a book. So both of them went first to Rome, avoiding old Germans, and then ended up in a small town called Palestrina, which is north of Rome. And they had separate bedrooms, but they had the same study, one at one table, one at the other, both of them attempting to write their first serious books. They talked about writing a book together to describe the family that they'd come from in Lübeck. But it was Thomas who wrote the book. Heinrich wrote other books, but Thomas began this novel, a novel called Buddenbrooks, where he attempted to reconstruct the house in Lübeck that was now gone. the family in Lübeck that was now gone. But he didn't just do what he remembered. In other words, it wasn't just reconstructing from memory the sort of childhood he had, the exotic mother, this father, this senator, the sense of trade, commercial life, warehouses, and stability, fixity in Lübeck. But he went back 3 generations. So that the novel is not merely a novel of memory, it's a novel of imagination. It's a novel attempting to reconstruct the full tradition of the Mann family that had declined and been lost, and that he could never get back again, except, of course, by using his imagination. He finished the book when he was 25, was published the following year, and it instantly made him a sort of famous figure, especially in the German cities, but slowly internationally. It was the book that in 1929 was cited as the book for which he had won the Nobel Prize, if it was for a single book, which it wasn't, but it was for a body of work. But Buddenbrooks was mentioned in the citation as being an important book. The question then for him was how to live, because it must have been clear to him at a certain point, it's certainly clear from his fiction, it's even there in Buddenbrooks, that his sexuality, he was certainly homosexual. And the question was how to live with that in the Germany of the 1890s. And, you know, he was himself, I think, quite a timid and conservative figure. He tended to wear, you know, he wasn't a bohemian, and he became fascinated by this family called the Pringsheims. He knew about them in Lübeck because he found a painting of this family, which you can still find. It's in the museum in Lübeck now, but he found a reproduction of it in a magazine of this family, this famous family in Munich, and the children all dressed up as sort of circus figures. He cut that out as a kid now might a rock star or a sports star, and he had it on his wall. Now he's in Munich, and these children in that painting are grown up, and they're the Pringsheims. 4 boys, 1 girl, assimilated Jews. Father is a professor of mathematics. One of the brothers is studying composing with Gustav Mahler in Vienna. All of them are doing something interesting. They're also fabulously wealthy. And they live in downtown Munich. They have a beautiful house, which is filled with paintings, beautiful furniture. They give marvelous parties, and are generally the life and soul of a sort of serious bohemia, or at least they're so highly cultured that Thomas Mann is fascinated by them. He sees them at concerts. Eventually, he gets invited to one of these fabulous parties, and he sees her, the daughter. She's called Katja. She's 20 years old. She's one of the very few German women studying science in a German university. She's the only girl of the family. She's beautiful. She's rich, and you know the idea that this would be his lifelong marriage. When he wrote to her to say he wanted to marry her, she had no interest in this because she was having a perfectly good life, thank you. But of course, for them, they cared so much about culture. This young man, even though he was from Lübeck, even though he was provincial, even though no one really knew anything about him, certainly the fact that he published this big book really mattered to these people, that this was what impressed them more than money or rank or social circumstances. The fact that he was an artist and had written a well-known book really made a difference to her, to her father, and to the family. And so he married her, and so they had 6 children. And my novel, The Magician, I think it's the story of a marriage as much as it's the story of a single man, but it's also, of course, the story of what happened to anyone living in Germany in the first half of the 20th century. And what's interesting now is how the man set up house. They have a summer house. They're living quite a high bourgeois life. Even later, after the First World War, in the years of inflation, they were not affected by inflation because Thomas Mann's books had begun to sell in America, in France, and in England. There's a picture offered of the 2 of them, Thomas Mann and his wife Katja, coming down the stairs of the great opera house in Munich. Their chauffeur waiting for them at the bottom of the stairs with, you know, her coat, his cloak, and outside their beautiful car to drive them home, as though they were sort of not exactly royalty, but part of but rich people, as indeed they were. And they built a beautiful house in Munich, and they spent their summers in various very nice watering hole. But what's interesting is that we see Thomas Mann very much as a liberal, as a Democrat, as someone who cares very deeply about, being an anti-fascist. But actually, when the First World War broke out, he was quite in favor of the German side. He was almost a sort of Prussian militarist. We watch him in these 4 years really going nuts. And we have a book to prove it called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, in which we see him not as a serious political thinker, but someone who's attracted very much by ideas of, for example, he's a monarchist. He's interested in Germany as a culture where all around it are its enemies, such as Russia, such as England, such as France, whose cultures are much lighter. He calls them a sort of civilization. He had begun a book before the war, or thought of a book to be about the sanatorium in Davos in Switzerland, where his wife Katia, who had tuberculosis, went. And he had by this time also written his novel Death in Venice, which is about a German writer going to Venice. What we find years later, I mean, really in the 1970s, I'm talking 60 years later, in the memoir that his wife Katia wrote at the end of her life, she dictated it. And she just says, yes, Tommy, and she calls him Tommy, and we went to Venice with Tommy's brother Heinrich. And yes, he did find a beautiful young man on the beach. And yes, he did keep staring at him. So he realized that Death in Venice is one way for him to sort of begin to dramatize his own sexual urges. In one way, he's an absolutely respectable family man and faithful husband. And the other side, he becomes fascinated by beauty, especially by male beauty, and especially by the beauty of young men. We see this later because at the end of his life, in his will, he left saying that, it's a clause saying that his diaries were to be published, I think it's 30 years and then 25 years after his death. And in his diaries, he shows he's giving a big lecture. He's got a big audience. He's wearing a three-piece suit. He really looks like the essence of respectability and scholarship. But actually, when he goes home, he says, there was a young man in the third row. And I noticed him. I caught his eye. His gaze mattered to me. And I realized that he's constantly involved in erotic imaginings and dreams, while at the same time being involved in the domestic life of his wife and his family. After the war, he changes. It's marvelous to watch these changes in him. He becomes, instead of a monarchist, he becomes a Democrat. And even more than a Democrat, he becomes someone who really fundamentally believes in the future of German democracy. He's working on his novel, The Magic Mountain, which is really set in the sanatorium in the Alps in Switzerland, where his wife was a patient. And, it becomes a sort of big book about ideas and about Europe and about militarism. And indeed is filled with human eccentricity, with strangeness of desire, with illness itself, being not just a metaphor, but actually something that's real, that's affecting people's lungs. And of course, he describes things such as the X-ray machine, such as the arrival of the gramophone in the sanatorium. So this novel, when it appeared in 1924, I think Copper fastened his reputation not only as a chronicler of the decline of the German mercantile classes, but also as someone who could write a novel which was, I suppose, formally fascinating, and was also intrigued by the very idea of time itself. In other words, Hans Castorp, who's the protagonist, he goes to the sanatorium to visit his cousin, as Thomas Mann went to visit his wife, and he plans to go for 3 weeks, and he ends by staying for 7 years. And so that idea of how time passes, what we notice first, that's familiar, that's not familiar, slowly becoming familiar. And once the objects around, the spaces become familiar, time moves in a completely different way than it does at the beginning. And of course, time in the novel is slowed down and then moves very quickly. So you're constantly involved with the drama surrounding time, as you are with the various arguments going on between people in the book over ideas of existence, ideas of politics, and ideas of Europe. And so what he wasn't noticing, and people like him were not noticing as the 1920s went on, was the rise of Hitler. He saw Hitler as a joke, even more than, say, people like me in America presumed that Donald Trump could never be elected president. People presumed that Hitler could never rise and become and become chancellor. It would have seemed unthinkable. But I mean, even more so than Trump, in the sense that Hitler was such an outsider. He came from absolutely nowhere. He had no money. He just seemed like a sort of demagogue, someone at the side of the street with a small little crowd around him. But he slowly built a force which became, strangely, an electoral force as much as it did a populist force. And this meant eventually that Thomas Mann, 4 years after he won the Nobel Prize, he was out of Germany when Hitler came to power in 1933. His children advised him not to come back in. It would be too dangerous. And so he did not come back in. He went into exile, and he remained outside the German-speaking world really for the next 20 years. He lost his house in Munich. He lost his beautiful house that he had built up on the Baltic. He lost a good deal of money. And of course, the big loss was the loss of a German readership. He was writing sentences now in a language in which the books might never appear. For 3 years after 33 to 36, he was afraid to denounce Hitler. He thought always, as many people did, that Hitler would just disappear. There would be a coup. He would be assassinated. He would just simply not be able to hang on to the reins of power. So he held on too, with his books still in print in Germany. In the big fire of writers' works in 33, Thomas Mann's books were not included. He was sort of a safer. He was outside that circle of dangerous writers. He seemed too respectable, too German, too sort of such a stalwart member of the literary community that his books were not included in the fire. But in 1936, he finally denounced Hitler. And of course, he lost his citizenship and now had to get Czech citizenship and had to start worrying that he had to get himself, his wife, his 6 children, his brother, his sister-in-law out of Europe. In other words, it became clear what was now going to happen or what was in danger of happening. And so he went first to Princeton, where he lived for about 3 years, from 1938 to 41. And then, like a lot of the German exiles, he moved to California. He moved specifically to Los Angeles, where he built a house in Pacific Palisades, a house that is still there, that the German government have recently bought and reconfigured. And what's clear once more is how much money he had. In other words, that his books were really selling in America. That any household above a certain level of culture would have the Thomas Mann novels in translation on the shelves. He was published by Knopf, and he really was the single German that everyone in America above a certain level of culture knew about and was reading and was thinking about. So much so, indeed, that the President Roosevelt had him to stay in the White House and realized that he was a figure of the center. And that really was what they were looking for. In other words, there were so many left-wing writers had arrived in America, such as Bertolt Brecht, such as Thomas Mann's brother Heinrich. Thomas Mann was much more a figure of the center and he had denounced Hitler and was considered to be a sort of a great Democrat. And so one by one, he got his children out of Europe. Sometimes at the very last minute, his son Golo, for example, or his daughter Monica was crossing in a ship that was torpedoed and really survived by holding onto a plank in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But they were the lucky ones, the Manns. They had not been affected by inflation. They had not had their lives destroyed in the 20s. And now they were, all of them, out of Europe in a safe place, which was California. What Thomas Mann had to worry about was something strange, was the idea, and all we have to do is think about it, that the music that he loved, the music that had mattered so much to him, that had entered his spirit and given it a sort of grace and glory, was the same music that Hitler loved and that had poisoned. Somehow the energy in the 19th century orchestral music had done something to the spirits of Hitler and his followers, had stirred them in such a way that it became sort of poisonous. And he had to start thinking about this as to what Germany was, what Germany meant, what Germany might become, in the light of the idea that the very height of its culture, the things that mattered most, the music of Wagner, Beethoven's symphonies, the great concert hall with the way in which the music was there to stir the spirit, and then the slow movement bringing it down into a sort of inward-looking melancholy, that all of this had been shared by people like him, who felt that the human spirit was something that would soar and was made to soar, and others listening to the same music who were now involved in mass murder and hatred and an effort to destroy the world. In my book, one of the things that Thomas Mann loved was Beethoven's chamber music. And in my book, he has his son, which did happen. You know, his son, Michael, becomes a viola player. And he asks Michael with his string quartet to play him in the new house he's made, to actually play Beethoven's Opus 132, which is one of the most beautiful of the quartets, with this sort of long, slow movement, which is one of the, I suppose, glories of German classical music. And of course, there's a purity about it too. It isn't the big orchestra. It's the lonely sound of the cello hitting against the viola and the violin coming in. And so during the war, Thomas Mann toured America, and he gave speeches in his faltering English to as many as 5,000 people who would come to hear him in places like Oklahoma, like Ohio, Chicago, all over America, where he would talk not about the need to defeat Hitler or what people had suffered under the Nazis, but his speech in general, there were variations of it, was called, in faltering English, the coming victory of democracy. What he was saying was that he represented a Germany that believed that democracy would eventually prevail, and that the German spirit was not a single thing that was poisoned and poisonous and dark and murderous, that there was another element in the German spirit. We think about this, say, the songs of Schubert, the songs of Schubert, a sort of lightness in the German spirit. But what he was talking about was a way in which ideas had developed to suggest that the human figure would prevail, would soar, that the spirit would matter, and it would no longer become sort of poisonous place, but a place that would be open to democracy. This is very important because there were many arguments at the time, especially in America, that Germany was doomed as a culture, that the entire country, having done 2 world wars, would go on to do more, and that it had to be that it had to be put down, that it had to be, in a way, almost erased as an economy, as a place that could grow in a military way again. Mann's argument was, no, there's something else in the spirit. He said, wherever I am, Germany is. And the Germany that he represented was a place that would, in the future, not only accept freedom, but demand freedom, and that freedom would be a democratic freedom. And I think this made a difference. At the same time, he was writing his novel, Dr. Faustus, which was some effort to look at the way where music itself, the idea of music, could be politicized, could be made poisonous, could be made pure, that was a metaphor he used for how certain forces had clashed in the Germany that he knew. When the war was over, the question was, where would he live? What would he do? And so people wanted him to go back to Germany, and he didn't want to do that. He said at one point, someone said, would you like to see your old friends? And he said, old friends? Most of them make me shudder. The very thought of what Germany had done in the war. The Americans didn't want him on a visit to Germany in 1949 to go into the Eastern Zone, which was the Soviet zone. Germany was divided. And he decided he would do that. He said he lived in language, and the language was not divided, and that he would not decide that he too had to take part in geopolitics since he was an artist. I think we could, all of us, argue with him about this. Certainly the Americans did. But in any case, he went into East Germany. And America became, I think, quite a cold place for him on his return. His daughter, Erica, had been very outspoken as an anti-fascist. She also did not have an American passport or even a visa. She had a British passport. And so the FBI made it clear to the daughter, Erica, that if she left America, they would make sure she didn't get back in. America was becoming, I think, having opened itself in so many ways in the war to saving Europe, now became a much more, I suppose, a more closed place. It was the beginning of the McCarthy period, where people were looking for communists everywhere, where the war was the Cold War, and they were asking, what side are you, Thomas Mann, in the Cold War? And he had no interest in the Cold War. And so the FBI came to question him a number of times. And eventually they decided in 1952, when he was 77 years old, that he would that they would leave, that they would sell the house in Pacific Palisades, and they would go to live not in Germany, but in Switzerland. And so they set out. He had 3 more years to live. What's wonderful is, in the last few years of his life, realizing that he had 1 more book to do, he wrote a comic novel about a chancer, about an imposter, And in a way, every writer has that feeling that somehow you spend your life making things up, finding versions of yourself or of reality, twisting things around, turning them. And that he, in a way, also had been an imposter. He had all his life, he had posed as a respectable married man, as someone who was, buttoned up and scholarly, whereas the diaries made clear that there was a much wilder person inside him, and indeed someone who had much to hide. And so this last book is called Confessions of Felix Cruel Confidence Man. And I think it does show him in a sort of new light. It was, I think, a very successful book because he's notable for a sort of heaviness in his prose and a sort of seriousness in his tone. But this last novel is as though at the end of his life he felt a new sort of lightness. And so that's the story of his life, and that's the story. I had 18 chapters to tell. I think with anyone who, if I gave any one of you all the information and said you have to bring this down to 18 chapters, I think all of us would write a different book, because all of us would use the things that interest us most. And all of us would end up, I think, not exactly writing a secret autobiography, that's far too strong, but we would show various elements of ourselves in the ways in which we would choose things in his life to work with. And certainly I wrote a good deal of the book. I wrote most of it, in fact, in Los Angeles. And I am from a northern landscape in this southern place, this place that has sun all the year round, which in Ireland is the most astonishing idea. Also, I'm the second son in a family of 5. Also, my father died when I was in my teens. But these maybe are just minor things, but nonetheless, they made me interested in him. And so I set about attempting to dramatize his life. I need to say one more thing, that in the 1920s, there was a crisis of authority in Germany. That it was the old crowd, the people who supported the Kaiser and were old-fashioned about authority. They had led everyone into the First World War, and the First World War had resulted in massive injuries and deaths and utter defeat. So what came in the early 20s was a new response to authority. Nobody who was young wanted any form of authority anymore. In any area, religion, politics, sexuality, what you did, what you wore. And Thomas Mann's 2 eldest children, Erika and Klaus, became the 2 poster children in this new Germany of the 20s for this new freedom. They slept with anyone they liked. They didn't mind that anyone knew they were gay. They traveled anywhere they wanted. They wrote what they liked. They came home regularly looking for money and with their stories to tell to their poor father, who was locked in this domestic circumstances, a most conservative man with these radical children. And that great drama between generations, I think, made a huge difference, because the children, and indeed Cathy, his wife, slowly changed Thomas Mann's mind about democracy, about Germany, and about the future. That in a way, as a married man and as the father of children, he became a new sort of person. But of course, the story is what happens to children like that, given such autonomy, winning such freedom in the early 1920s, to find that they think the narrative is going to be further freedom, further loss of authority for other people, without realizing that in the back streets, moving towards the side streets, moving towards the big streets, are coming people who feel seriously disenfranchised, and inflation has mattered to them, but also something in the spirit of the time, the people wanting not only order, a sense of a new order, but wanting some sort of way in which violence might actually become this thrilling thing and of course, inventing an enemy. There had to be an enemy. There always has to be an enemy in these situations. And the enemy had to be the Jewish population. And of course, Thomas Mann's wife was a secular Jew. They didn't go to the synagogue. But of course, by 1933, they were named as Jewish, and they were enemies of the state, which meaning that their children, Thomas Mann's children, were considered to be Jewish. And thus were in real danger as the 1930s went on, as Germany made it clear that it intended to go right down into France, and that no one was safe. And so we have a drama between people who have won this absolute freedom in the 1920s, having that freedom totally eroded and taken away from them a decade later. And then what do you do? How do you live as an exile? what is exile like? What happened in Los Angeles to this group of German intellectuals and their children as they attempted to find, I suppose, a sort of safe haven from Germany, but that always there is the shadow not only of Germany, but the shadow that they're not in their own country, and that everything that's happening is happening at one remove. So that's the story of the novel The Magician. And if anyone has any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to hear you.
We have a lot of great audience questions that have come in already, but audience, if you have more, please put them into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. That's where it will be easiest for us to find them. We're going to start off with a great question that came from Jessica, saying, I believe that writers frequently only have one specific reoccurring theme throughout all of their works, but you've got me puzzled. Is there a common theme throughout your work? And if so, what is it?
Oh, I think that's a really important question. You know, I think that Isaiah Berlin talked about people being divided between foxes and hedgehogs, that foxes have to know many small things in order to get around. A hedgehog just has to know one big thing. And I think what I was talking about earlier, the idea of loss and the idea of something that's disappeared can be recreated in words and can be brought back. I probably think that's in every book of mine, the idea of a disappeared world or something that's missing, something that was there that's now gone, a house, a person, a set of circumstances. And I probably, without knowing it, work or being too conscious of it, I work from that all the time. And so maybe that might be the thing. But the problem with that is that if I've written 10 novels, I think half of them are set in a small town that I'm from in Ireland. And the other half are so far away, like Lubeck, Los Angeles, Henry James's Venice, Spain, the Virgin Mary. You know, in other words, it seems as though after every book I write set in Ireland, I think I'd never want to do that. I don't want any more rain, Catholic guilt. You know, I don't want any more island light. I want to go somewhere big and brave and better. And so I go to that, and then I get guilty about, why am I writing about Henry James? Well, what do I know about all that? And then I go back to the town, I go back to the streets again.
Thank you so much. There's a question here from Diana. She says, how much freedom do you give yourself to imagine the life of Thomas Mann or Henry James? Does it pain you if you're not historically accurate?
I think that you make a sort of pact with the reader that if I say Thomas Mann was in Munich in that year, then he was. If I'd say he had 6 children, I mean, 6 children is very hard to do in a novel. It's too many children. My advice to any novelist, don't have 6 children, have 3 at the most, because you have to keep them all going. But I couldn't obviously just reduce his number of children to 5 just because I wanted to. So I didn't have that freedom. But obviously I'm not in the room. Now, my job is not to give you all the information and knowledge you need as a biographer might, or analyze his life. My job is to give you enough images that the illusion will be created that you're in the room, or that you know him, or that you are him. So I'm involved constantly in illusion creating. So the dialogue, for example, what do you do with dialogue? You're writing in English, it's in another language, and it's 100 years ago. Are you going to try and get a sense of their Germanness as they speak? I think if you do that, you lose the book. So what I did was I wrote dialogue of the 1920s in English, sharp, you know, a lot of interruption, a lot of people trying to say something smart, especially when his children are talking. But but the general, I suppose, scaffolding or the sort of structure is based on fact. And then within that is what I'm interested in. I mean, I'm interested not just in the scaffolding or the structure, but opening the doors and going into the rooms that are otherwise, you know, closing the door behind me and seeing something, I suppose, private, going into the private realm of his thoughts and indeed of what has happened to people around him. So I am playing a game between fact and fiction, but the purpose of the game is to create illusion, and the purpose of the illusion is to make you believe you're there.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question comes from Betsy, and she'd like to know, did Thomas Mann regain an audience in Germany later in life, and how was your book received there?
And You know, the family now in Germany is a sort of royal family, and a lot of people know about every one of them. Even the minor members of the family are sort of have biographies of them or are known about. I think after the war, Heinrich Mann, the brother, became very famous in East Germany because he was a sort of left-wing figure. And of course, Thomas Mann is considered canonical. And yes, of course, it isn't merely as a writer he's important. He's important as a political figure. Who else was good in these years? Who else can be looked up to? Who else spoke out? Who else was eloquent in these years? And so that my efforts to say he was a fragile person. He was frail. He wasn't always right. He certainly wasn't right in 1914. And also that you know, he was a closeted homosexual, and I didn't make this up. It's in his diaries. It's in, you know, like it's in the novels. So obviously, my presence in Germany about a year ago was there was always an element of being watched as the outsider come in to sort of perhaps destroy someone, but some of the writing about it, the book was fine, and in a way, just for me, just going to Lubeck and doing a reading in the church where he would have gone as a young man, and having all the people from Lubeck come to that was enough. I mean, I was happy enough. I mean, you can't. I suppose he is an iconic figure in Germany, a country that doesn't have many 20th century icons.
Thank you. There's a question here from Miriam, and she asks, what was life like for Mann's wife with his erotic longings for young men?
You know, it'd be so easy to have made her into the sad wife of a closeted homosexual, and she's all sad every day. She came from a real bohemian world. Her grandmother was the most famous feminist in Germany when she was growing up. And her grandmother took the view that it would be better if all men were homosexual. That'd be very good, because then they could just leave women alone. And that would be the most marvelous thing. And her grandmother loved Death in Venice because it just for once had an image of same-sex desire. So she came from a world where, you know, Freud's ideas were coming into vogue, where everyone was meant to have a secret life, secret desires. She came out of all that world. Her twin brother was homosexual. So it wasn't that strange. And what's interesting is how they had 6 children in the middle of all this is a mystery. But he never looked at another woman. I mean, there's nothing, not a moment where he's doing this. And her father was a great philanderer and was with actresses. So she didn't have that trouble. And she was also a very tolerant, good-humored, ironic person. And she made the best of everywhere she went. She was intensely loyal to him. But she's a person of great independent mind. So it wasn't as though she decided she would suffer and thus suffered. It didn't feel like that. But it must have had its moments, but she kept them to herself.
Thank you. The next question is from Judy, and she'd like to know, what's your view of what gave Mann the resilience to survive all of the incredibly difficult times and personal issues that he went through?
I think entitlement, self-importance, ambition. I think these things were very, very rich in him. That he was the second son, that his brother was stronger than he was. His brother was heterosexual. His brother was socialist. He was always the pale second son. And speaking as one, I know that you have to make much greater effort in the world in order to thrive if you come in that position in a family. And but yes, I think he began to see, once the first novel appeared, that he didn't just have a great talent, but that he actually was a great man. And that idea of being a great man, you can see it in his lectures. You can see it. He's always giving lectures on the big subjects, on the importance of Goethe, on the importance of Freud, on, you know, every large subject he's in there. And therefore, the idea of being flung out of his own country by this horrible little failed artist called Hitler would have really, really irritated him, not only politically and ideologically, but also on the basis of just being proud and thinking, who is he to tell me where I should live? So yeah, there are elements in him that are not necessarily admirable. He didn't suffer from humility, for example.
It's a question here from both Marianne and Susan, and I'll use Susan's how she phrases it. She says, why did you pick Thomas Mann? What were you trying to convey about his life in the novel, and what was true, and what did you imagine happened?
It begins with love. I mean, that when I think it's true for all of us as readers, that we read certain books aged about 18, 19, 20, that really lifted us out of ourselves and gave us a sense of possibility, and that we didn't ever read with the same sort of richness and intensity again. And what I was doing at that age was I was reading Thomas Mann and I was reading Henry James. I was reading other books too, but they were the two figures. Now, I knew very little, just to take the Thomas Mann one. There was really no biography of him then. I'm talking about the 1970s, that you just saw this figure I've been describing, this very scholarly, serious man. And it was really only when the diaries came out, and they came into English, I suppose, in the 1990s, early 90s, that you began to see that he was a much more fragile figure. I suppose I began thinking that writers wrote from entitlement, certainty, stability, seriousness, and that, their names on the cover of the book, their photographs, their whole, I realized the first time I realized that wasn't true was Virginia Woolf. When I read a biography of her, realizing just how much pain, just how much uncertainty, unease, or shivering fear went into the making of her. And that went into the making of the books. And so too, oddly enough, with Thomas Mann. So the distance between the figure I had believed was there and the figure I now knew was there, it gave me a sort of drama I could work with. And as I said before, I did, in as much as possible, stick to the facts as regards where he was or how many. But obviously there's so many scenes where he's having a private conversation with his wife, or he's having thoughts, or anytime there's dialogue. Obviously I wasn't there. I wasn't writing it down. So that's all imagined.
The next question is actually very relevant. It comes from Teresa. She wants to know, when did you first read Thomas Mann, and which work was the first of his works that you read?
When I was a student in University College Dublin, it was fashionable to read The Magic Mountain. So if you were reading The Magic Mountain, you were also seeing the films of Godard or the films of Birdman. And not James Joyce, oddly enough, but this European. We were all trying to be European, and this novel was the great big European novel filled with debate. So it started with The Magic Mountain, and then in that period in the 70s also, the film of Death in Venice came. Therefore, everyone knew Death in Venice. It used Mahler's music, and so that became famous. I have to say, I found the film almost unwatchable now, sort of sugary and overdone. But at the time, it was all new, and it was fascinating. And then I went on to read, Buddenbrooks and the rest of the books. But the first one was The Magic Mountain.
Thank you. This next question is from Connie. She says, his children seem to have had a love-hate relationship with him. Do you have any more insight into why they spoke to him so sharply, yet seemed to rally around him? Was it more than just needing money?
I think that fatherhood in the early 20th century was different to now. In other words, fathers were not expected then to sort of hug their children or be nice to them. They were sort of remote figures, and they left their children in the nursery in the care often of maids or nurses. And but there was something very particular happened, and it's described by his son Golo, that Thomas Mann became immensely grumpy from about 1912 or 13 onwards. The first reason was that his wife was in a sanatorium. So he suddenly had these children, these wild, loquacious children with opinions on everything. They wouldn't obey anyone, let alone their scholarly father. And then when the First World War broke out, he really became that figure. All of us live in, the grumpy father who comes in all grumpy to the table, wanting everyone to have table manners. Well, he was that. And so for those few years, he became not only a distant figure, but someone who really did and really annoy his children. And then what I talked about happened, which is the great end of authority. So that young people in the 20s, they spent their time insulting their parents or just doing whatever they wanted to do. But of course, they always lived in his shadow. It's not just the money. It is that their name, when his two eldest, when they start to write, everyone knew who they were. All doors were open for them. They were the man children. And it became true as well that even when you thought the children should have grown up and moved away from him, they were always coming for Christmas, or were always looking for money, or always looking for advice, that they remained children, especially the eldest ones did, right through, because people couldn't put down roots in the Germany of that time. But that they remained, I think all of them remained obsessed with him. even after his death. And one of them, Elizabeth, who was the youngest girl, said something so clever that I think it should be written up on walls. She said, after 30, after 30, no one has the right to blame their parents for anything.
Uh-oh. We are getting low on time, but I wanted to get to this question from Nancy. She commented, I felt with reading The Master that I didn't need to know much about Henry James's work, but with The Magician, I was very grateful that I had read most of Mann's work. What do you think is the importance of people having read these authors' work before encountering your novels?
Yes, I think that's correct. I think that with the Master, I'm not really going into the plots of James's novels, that it is more or less him in a fallow period of his life. He's writing The Turn of the Screw, but the big novels are already, Portrait of a Lady is already written, and the three big novels, Wings of the Dove, Golden Bowl, and The Ambassador, are to come. So it's a 5-year period where he's just struggling with things are haunting him. I couldn't do that with The Magician, simply because the reader has to know that in 1913, Thomas Mann did not expect the First World War to break out. And it has to be dramatized in the novel in real time. And each book he wrote really changed his life. For example, writing Buddenbrooks made him a famous young author. Writing The Magic Mountain set him up as the essential figure in German literature of the 1920s. Writing Dr. Faustus at the end of his life was one way of going back into trying to reconstruct a Germany that he lost. And of course, Death in Venice, it can be read a number of ways, but it was his book where he attempted to dramatize his own sexuality. So, I mean, I would hope with the book you don't have to have read the books, but it might lead you on to want to read them or get more curious about them. But his own life was affected deeply, not only by the wars, not only by his marriage and his children, but by the books he wrote himself. Those books affected the way he lived and how he was seen. You can't write a novel about him without actually going into what those books are.
Thank you. And there's, for our final question tonight, there's been a number of questions in the audience about this. And that's the question is, what is next from you? What's the subject of your next book? Do you have something in mind?
I'm writing a novel. I mean, I'm trying to finish it, which is, I mean, it's not exactly a sequel to Brooklyn, to the novel I wrote, Brooklyn, but it is the same people. And it is 25 years later. And this is what it looks like at the moment. You can see. So I'm writing it in this big book. And so, yeah, it's the story of the people of Brooklyn, the people of that book, especially Ailish, but all of them really, 25 years later. So that's what I'm writing at the moment.
That is a very exciting thing to have to look forward to, I think, for all of us here. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. This was really quite lovely and wonderful.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yes, and thank you.
When you read out that list of bookstores, you know, a lot of them which I know, it was just great to hear their names.
Yes.
R.J. Julia and Tattered Cover and all those, and indeed your own. So
yes, I will actually read that list again in just a second for everyone here.
It's such a great list. It's when times are dark, when the winter really comes down, or when someone didn't get elected, you wanted to be elected. Just think of that list of bookstores, independent bookstores in America.
Bookstores are one of the great joys. So thank you so much to our friends at Yaddo for supporting tonight's event, and also to the wonderful folks at Anderson's Bookshop, Bookhampton, Book Passage, Changing Hands Bookstore, Gibson's Bookstore, the King's English Bookshop, Pegasus Books, R.J. Julia Booksellers and R.J. Julia Wesleyan, and the Tattered Cover, and from all of us at Northshire Bookstore in upstate New York and Vermont. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thank you all for your support of independent bookselling.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you so much, Colm. Good night, everyone.
Night.